Welcome to Echo Ekoji. I'm Andrea Chapman, joined by my co-host Joe Gochi. It's hard to believe this is already our 9th episode this year. We're thrilled about today's interview and have some exciting surprises lined up for the rest of 2024. Our goal is to share the Buddha Dharma through the unique voices and stories of Ekoji's Sangha members. Joe, before we begin, please tell our listeners, how did you find Ekoji?
Thanks, Andrea. I found Ekoji during the pandemic, and what struck me was how it offers a modern American twist on Jodo Shinshu Buddhism that really resonated with me. The dedication of Ekoji's ministerial staff and lay members is inspiring. The Dharma messages and discussions have illuminated the Buddha Dharma for me. And even though I have strong ties to Seattle and White River temples out in the state of Washington, my sense of the Sangha now reaches coast to coast, which is pretty neat. So Andrea, let's introduce our next guests.
We are delighted to welcome Maya and Brant Horio, two esteemed members of Ekoji Sangha. Welcome, Maya and Brant.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I want to begin with a question for Maya. Maya, growing up in a family with deep roots in Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, how did your parents and grandparents shape your early understanding and appreciation of the tradition?
Buddhism has really just been an integral part of my entire life. And just to give a little bit of background, right? My mom's dad, who we call my Oji-chan, was a Buddhist minister and came from a long line of Buddhist ministers. And so thanks to our son's genealogy project, we found out that we can actually trace the lineage back 15 generations. So I'm a 4th generation Japanese American, but I'm a 15th generation Jodo Shinshu Buddhist. And on my dad's side too, his parents grew up in the religion. When they left the internment camps, they moved to Seabrook, New Jersey, and they were part of the group of founding families for Seabrook. And then when my parents came to the Virginia area, they helped to start the Ekoji. Ekoji wasn't there yet, so they helped to start the Washington, D.C. Children's Dharma School. And then that eventually led to Ekoji. So, Buddhism has been a strong part of my life since I was little. It was things in our daily lives, right, where, certainly on Sundays we would go to Dharma school, but even in our daily practices before every meal, we had this little saying that was written on our napkin holder with a picture of Hansen Gasho that we would recite before every meal and then end in the Itadakimasu, Namo Itadakimasu. Other things like every time we made a pot of rice, which was very often, we would offer the fresh rice and put it on the Obutsudan. Or our home altar. Anytime we got gifts from friends or family, those first went to the Obutsudan as a mark of our gratitude for being thought of and for receiving that gift, right? So it was really a part of my just my whole childhood growing up, and I think subconsciously, those are sort of the practices that were built in. But I think even subconsciously, I watched my grandparents be leaders in their temple community, right? Whenever we would visit them in New Jersey, I remember traipsing along with my grandmother as she would go from her board meetings to, other community meetings, and watching my parents also serve in different leadership roles in the temple at Ekoji, whether that was as Dharma school teachers or on the board or what have you. I think Ekoji and Jodo Shinshu Buddhism has been a part of my life for as long as I can remember.
Brant, tell our viewers about that moment when you decided to visit Ekoji Buddhist Temple after your grandfather's passing. And how did that experience reconnect you with your childhood memories and shape your journey into Jodo Shinshu?
Yeah, it's always interesting when I hear, individuals such as Maya who were born into the religion and kind of talk about their experiences. Because mine was like very, very different. So I was born in Hawaii. I grew up there until I was about 8. And a lot of Japanese American sort of like culture in Hawaii. I mean, a lot of houses do have an obutsudan. They do go to a Buddhist temple for services and those kinds of things. But I would say I don't know like how much the Dharma is like very prevalent in the majority of those households. It's certainly there, right? But like for our family, for instance, like we would light incense at the Obutsudan. My grandpa had one, and so forth. And we would always, the first thing we do is always go into the room with the Obutsudan, light some incense, put our hands in gasho, and then we'd bow. But like we wouldn't say anything, and there was no like deep dharma associated with it, other than just thinking that you are paying respects to your ancestors, which I now recognize as interdependence and causes and conditions and those kinds of things. But my earliest memories of my grandfather are like hearing him chant down the hall because he was Jodo Shinshu. Every morning he'd wake up early and chant some sutra or jusege or something, and you'd smell the incense sort of like wafting down the hall. So I have that image, seared in my brain about what it was like with him. And then when he died, he lived in Hawaii, and then we had moved to Virginia at that time. It was really hard to find closure because he was so far away. So when my parents were here, we decided, I had driven by Ekoji. I was like, hey, let's just go for old time's sake, listen to some chanting, smell incense, and then we can remember him and like have him really close in this time of like wanting to be closer to him. So we went. I met Maya's dad for the first time there. He was the first person we met at Ekoji. And then, from there, it just spun off into like a lot of different engagements, from Taiko with Nendaiko to Dharma school teacher to events, and and as I said, the rest is history. But that's how we came in trying to just reconnect.
So, Brant, let me follow up on that. Having grown up with a mix of religious influences, but arriving at Ekoji with no specific religious beliefs, how did your involvement with the temple and the community gradually influence your understanding and acceptance of Jodo Shinshu teachings?
Yeah, that background's pretty varied. So my mom had grown up in the Methodist church. When I was a kid, I went to Baptist temple when I was in Hawaii. And then when I came here, then I went to Lutheran. I even participated in like a vacation Bible schools. And my dad was Buddhist, but he followed a lot of Zen stuff as well. And then, but there was never a lot of pressure or like that was a core part of the identity. And then my parents just let us do what we wanted, and then we decided just not to go. So I think it never was really defining. I was somewhere between atheist and spiritual, I guess, but there was really no label on it. It just wasn't a priority or like a defining feature of who I am. After I came to Ekoji, I think the soft introduction to Jodo Shinshu came from Nendaiko, which is something I was really passionate about. I really wanted to learn Taiko. Maya was my mentor. So I met her through, really got to know her through Taiko. You've heard about Buddhist Taiko from Emily Ihara, who spoke, I think, 2 episodes ago. So that was a soft introduction, right? I mean, it's things that I think if you've ever played in a group or operated in a group or on a team, these are things that are second nature about, working as a team, and, you can't do it on your own. And but the Buddhist framing on it of interdependence, of the 3 treasures, of suffering, of ego, those kinds of things, really kind of like set that foundation. And then from Taiko, because of also my relationship with Maya, she was like, oh, we need a Dharma school teacher for pre-K, come on in. And I think the best way to describe this moment in my life, which was like, I think the biggest growth in my Buddhist understanding, is that there's this really excellent series on YouTube by Wired. It's called like explaining one concept, one complex topic in 5 different ways. And they go from child to teenager to undergrad to graduate to professional. So they explain things like quantum computing or blockchain or something else. And I think it really reinforces something that I hold dear, which is like, if you try to explain one idea in many different ways, you not only like impart that knowledge, but you really solidify what that is for you. So being a Dharma school teacher was extremely formative. Talking about 3 treasures, but then dana, and then how do you talk about paramitas, and then you're kind of like breaking down all the Jataka tales and personifications and just getting to the meat of it as a layman, right? Using my own personal experiences, almost like a forcing function. And that was really informative. And that really led to, I think, understanding and acceptance of the teachings.
Brant, I spent 30 years in a high school teaching government and U.S. history, and the best way to learn something is to teach it. So I fully appreciate what you're saying there. Maya, I've been told that your parents played a very creative and pivotal role in teaching Dharma school. And I've heard about your mom's pictograph for teaching the Eightfold Path. How do these early lessons shape your perception of the Dharma? And do you incorporate similar methods as a Dharma school teacher?
When Ekoji was founded, Reverend Kurt Rye also understood that even for our Dharma school students, or especially for our Dharma school students, we might be the only Buddhists who our friends around us know. And so there was a really conscious effort made to really teach the Dharma to the kids, no matter how young you were. We were really treated as learners and practitioners of the Dharma from the time that we were little as Dharma school kids. And so I think that each of the teachers tried to find ways to help us understand the Dharma and meeting us where we were, whether that was through pictographs, right? I remember my mom holding up her poster that she had written VT Sclem and had little pictures like so that we could see the thing, right? And clearly it stuck. My dad was our Dharma school teacher throughout my middle school and high school years, right? And there was a very strong focus on imparting the Dharma. And most of our student cohort went through the Dharma Award Program or there's different scouting awards as well. And that really has a number of components to help you learn the basic tenets of Buddhism, and then Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. And then we also did comparative Buddhism, where we went to different other temples and other faiths to then compare it to the teachings that we had been learning about. We also did things like leading service and having to give our own Dharma talks as Dharma school students. Mm-hmm. And that was a pretty unusual practice. I think it tends to even still be somewhat unusual to have Dharma school students doing this. But all of this was in the vein of really helping us be able to explain in our own words what Buddhism is, what Buddhism means to us, because we would inevitably be asked about it by those who had never met a Buddhist. So I think, now when I came back to the area and started teaching Dharma school and then eventually became the superintendent and the co-superintendent of the Dharma school, we still try to instill those values, right? But also recognizing that our Sangha has changed. We try to meet the kids where they are, even though we don't have as much time with them now as we did when I was growing up, right? When I was growing up, we had Dharma school service every Sunday, plus an hour of class every Sunday. And now we've sort of walked that back to where the Dharma school meets 3 times a month at Ekoji. 2 of those times are for classes, 1 hour classes, and then 1 Dharma school service. So we have less time with the students, but we really do try to use that time wisely to really teach the Dharma to the students. And it's kind of like the wired framework that Brant was just talking about, right? Where we broke down the Dharma Award concepts and built that into the curriculum at each of the levels for Dharma school, so that over time you hear many of the same teachings, but you get to dig a little bit deeper. And I unfortunately am not as creative as my mom was or Brant, right? So it's been very helpful having Brant as part of our teaching group of teachers, because he's injected a lot of different creative ideas, right? And he wrote an article for the Kalavinka about some of those, where they built their own board game for the pre-K and kindergarten class that was based on Candyland, but was more collaborative in nature. He was doing escape rooms, and I feel like my students, when Brant and I were not co-teaching, my students were always jealous because you could hear laughing and screaming coming from his classroom, right, as they were doing escape rooms or other types of games, really having to practice the Dharma. But we do try to still instill in the Dharma in the kids, right? But in ways that they can hear it and ask questions and really apply it to their own lives.
Maya, you've described your own Dharma school friends as your tribe. How did these relationships influence your experience of Buddhism as a young person? And how do you see these connections impacting your life today?
Yeah. So, looking back, I think my initial group of Dharma school students, that our time together was what I would call my first experience with the 3 treasures, right? The Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, because they really were my Sangha or my Dharma buddies, as I think you often hear the term. So there was probably 4 or 5 families. We were all Japanese American Buddhist, around the same age, growing up in the Northern Virginia, DC area. And most of us were the only Japanese American Buddhists other than our sibling, right, at our schools. And, you know, a lot of the students around us were Caucasian and Christian and had never heard of Buddhism really, or only knew it as like monks in robes who were beggars on the street or what have you. So it was a very sort of limited idea of what Buddhism was. And most people didn't know Japanese Americans, right? So we would get outside of our time at the temple with each other. We would have to navigate those dynamics on a regular basis, right? We would constantly, every one of us had an experience of being told that we were going to hell. And, you know, one of my friends, not in like a mean-hearted way, but one time was like, oh, you must worship the butt because you're a Buddhist. Ha 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 ha, so funny, right? And like learning how to respond to those kinds of questions. It can be hard when you feel isolated, but I never felt isolated because I had my Dharma school friends, and really they were more than friends. They were like family, right? They were my extended brothers and sisters, who we could complain to each other. We could vent about things that we were hearing. We could trade like, how did you respond? Or what would you say in this instance? And it wasn't even limited to my friends, right? It was also their parents and Reverend Suji, and it was like our Dharma family was the Ekoji family, right? I remember talking to Reverend Suji once because I grew up doing Japanese dance, and we were dancing down on the Washington Mall area, and someone came up to me, an adult came up to me when I was dressed in my yukata and said, "Did you know your people bombed my people at Pearl Harbor?" And I was probably, I don't know, 15, maybe 14, 15. And I was a little bit, I didn't know what to say. So I just kind of was silent. And I was recounting this to Reverend Suji, and Reverend Suji joked that I should have said, well, I'm Chinese. It's just like, that was just kind of his like sense of humor, right? But it was having that sort of safe space where I could just be myself and experience what I was experiencing and share those experiences to people who just sort of got it, right? So we learned the Dharma together. We practiced the Dharma together, but we were also each other's backs and hearts. And so that was a really important group for me growing up. And we continue to stay in touch throughout high school and college and grad school, even though half of our tribe sort of moved to California. So we're no longer physically close and, you know, exchange Christmas cards. But when we get back together every now and then, yeah, it's really, you can still feel those family bonds. And I think it really instilled in me, just even though my initial group of friends is no longer at the temple, that is still to me what Ekoji is, right? It is a place for family and for friendship and comfort and safe space.
Thanks for sharing that story, Maya. The two of you are our first husband-wife, and obviously share parenting duties as well. So there are going to be several questions related to that. Brant, as a husband and partner to Maya, how has your understanding and shared commitment to the Buddha Dharma shaped your marriage and influenced your approach to parenting and your relationship with your children?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is just trying to keep up. Maya does a lot. She always talks about like having, you know, physical bones in her body, but that all those dwarf sort of like the gigantic obligation bone in her body. So that's, you know, and I think that's just been like a core feature of you know, our relationship. I think there's a very much like a shared commitment to 100% having the temple continue to succeed and exist as this, you know, what she called a safe place for exploration and understanding and taking in the Dharma. And this, you know, this kind of commitment ranges from things like large scale involvement to a bond to, you know, me just breaking off and having a side conversation with new members that may have questions or concerns that, you know, we don't talk about, you know, to say, hey, I'm going to go do this. We just do it, right? And I think our partnership in respect is really characterized by that, and that carries over into our marriage, carries over into partnership, where parenthood, where we recognize, as with the three treasures, like we can't really be fully effective if we're trying to do this on our own, that there's this implicit trust that we have to have in the other, that they can, while we take care of this, like something else is going to happen, and you just have that implicit trust, and there's a seamless sort of handoff with full faith and trust that we're going to get to that end goal, but we're all taking on different parts, and we tag up every now and then, but it's very much a partnership in that way, and I think it's the thing I love most about our relationship. This is, to me, like the epitome of interdependence. It's about also the epitome of adaptation, which is linked to things like impermanence, because we're gonna have very significant losses. We're gonna have significant moments. We're gonna have challenges. Life's not easy. It's not straightforward. But it's very much a partnership in terms of the middle path, right? Where we're avoiding the extremes and controlling what we can and reacting and adapting to what we can. I think we try to convey these messages to our kids in words for the Dharma, but that's not, I think, really our emphasis or our focus on it. It's more about just quiet leadership by example. So Dharma by example is, I think, a good way of explaining like how our relationship sort of translates into parenthood.
Brant, you mentioned your motivation for everything is family-centric. How does your practice of Jodo Shinshu Buddhism help you balance your deep attachment to your family with the Buddhist understanding of suffering and impermanence?
Yeah, I think this is something that I think has developed over time, but I think it fully characterizes where I think I am and will be, right? So I think in this aspect of Buddhism, like I'm not sure how much this will further evolve, and I'm totally fine with that, right? And that's based on the idea that family to me is really everything, and that my understanding of Buddhism and the Dharma, I think in its current state, is really about the purpose of Buddhism. Simply is to expose and drive awareness of suffering, its nature, and that an end exists, right? I don't personally think that Buddhism is to end suffering. It's to just expose its nature. And I think what's paradoxical about that is that I believe, like in effect, like that understanding actually does help end suffering a little bit, right? My attachments to Maya, to my kids, I know that will lead to like unending suffering for the challenges they're going to face, for things that are going to happen. We all get sick, but there's going to be some good moments too, and those are going to be the things that I live for. So I think how that translates is that I fully submit myself knowingly to a life of suffering, right? The cost of nirvana is too high for me right now.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that kind of describes my thinking on that.
As the father of a 39-year-old son and a 42-year-old daughter, I fully appreciate what you just said. It continues, and you look forward to those wonderful moments that you'll share, and you realize that they too are impermanent. Maya, I'm going to stick with the family role that you two play. And I want you to think deeply about the way that Buddhism plays into your everyday life with your children and how you go about raising them.
For me, some of what I'll talk about flows and just kind of amplifies some of Brant's thoughts, right? I think certainly the idea of the Ichigo Ichie, right? That you only get this. There have been a million causes and conditions that brought us to this exact point in time, right? And there will never be another moment exactly like this moment. I think we try to keep that in mind for whether it's between Brant and I and our interactions or with our kids, right? Even our kids are now 14 and 12, and Joe, like you said, right, that time has been such a blur. And I think it's nice actually, because with modern technology on my phone, every day, I get this little, like, from my photos, my photo collections, whatever, it's on this day 5 years ago or something, right? And I try to look at those every day, because they're just those little reminders, and you spend like that 30 seconds being like, oh my gosh, they were so small. And like, they were, when the kids are around, we'll tell them, like, you guys were so cute. What happened? Right. But I think, so it's certainly the idea of impermanence, but I think also it's also recognizing that we're not the only influence in our kids' lives, right? And we are there to support them and help give them a foundation, but we really try to give them space to let them learn and define themselves. And we are there as sort of curious and supportive, and sometimes annoyed bystanders in that, right? So we're only one influence in their lives. And that to me is part of the mental perspective that we put into raising them. And I think in terms of what we teach them, they go to Dharma school. So again, we're not their only influence, although we do teach them too. But I think some of it's also making sure that they understand life is suffering and what that suffering looks and feels like, because it's a spectrum of just little annoyances to really sort of deep cuts. And understanding that, yes, life is suffering, but Buddha didn't just stop there, right? He gave us tools to think about, why are we suffering, and how do we help alleviate our suffering and that of others? And I think we've been really proud in seeing the compassion in our kids, right? That was something that we stressed really early on to the kids, right? We've never really been about grades. Like, we want them to bring their best self to everything that they're doing. But when, like, the mantra that we had for the kids growing up was brave heart, strong heart, kind heart, right? And those were things that you practiced for yourself, but also on behalf of others, recognizing that we are one in a broader world and a broader community. And we really want the kids to really feel that. And I think we've been really pleased by the humans that they're turning out to be, even if our son forgets his water bottle everywhere he goes.
Andrea, I'd like to ask just one quick follow-up to that. In our first email exchange, Brant told me that one of his goals every day was to make Maya laugh. And Brant, I can see why you want her to laugh, because her laugh is infectious. So Maya, tell me a little bit about the importance of humor and laughter within our tradition and within our lives.
So I don't know if I can speak to it as much within our tradition, right? I mean, I feel like even Shinran calling himself a bombu, the foolish one, right? I mean, I think it's kind of a natural output of working to internalize the teachings, right? Is you start to recognize how I realize on a regular basis how foolish I am, right? And how many foolish things happen in life, whether they're intentional or not, right? And so people often see me as like a very optimistic, sort of happy-go-lucky kind of person. And I am, but I think that's also because it's sort of a natural output, right, of understanding your own foolishness and living a life of gratitude, right? That you can be grateful that you can laugh at yourself. And then I can't remember how many times I've walked out of, work kind of looking like an idiot because I'm like giggling to myself about something that happened or something stupid that I did, right? And I will often laugh to the point of crying. So I'm like constantly like wiping away tears during the day. And Brant It's true. Like he will, whether it's intentional humor or just being silly or what have you, like he makes me laugh to the point of crying every day.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, just one more thought on that too. I think the other way that laughter plays into our tradition is, in my mind, simply not to take everything so seriously,
Yeah.
right? Because if you do, you are potentially subjecting yourself to yet another attachment, right? Like, I must be serious because I must memorize and like annotate and fully comprehend every intentional phrase within this Heart Sutra, right? That becomes an attachment, right? And you're just setting yourself up for even more. So learn what you can, demonstrate or live what you can, and just be easy on yourself. Like, cut yourself some grace.
Yeah, can I also interject? It's funny because I think one way you see that play out in our kids is we actively make fun of each other in our family, and we were a little worried about our daughter at first because even if she made a joke and we laughed when she was little, she would start crying because she thought that we were laughing at her. And we're like, this is not going to work, right? Like, so some of our proudest moments are when our kids make fun of us in ways that are like just right for the context and like really funny. Those are proud moments.
Very good. Thank you.
You can never have too much laughter. So, Maya, I have a question for you. You spent some time as a student teacher in Japan. How did that experience deepen your understanding of Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, and what insights did you gain from living in a culture where Buddhism is more prevalent and ingrained in daily life?
I mean, I loved my time in Japan. So I lived in Nagoya as a student with a host family, and then I lived in Mie Prefecture, halfway between Osaka and Nagoya, in my own apartment when I was teaching in Japan, or teaching English in Japan. So, the question for me is, it's a little hard to answer because as a Japanese American Buddhist, right, there were many parts of living in Japan that felt very comfortable because they were they culturally fit with where I was coming from, right? So it felt very comfortable in some ways and uncomfortable in others because of the American side of me, right? So it can be hard to pull apart, I think, the growth and that, like, what parts of that feeling of comfort came from Japan having a lot of Buddhist principles built in, or it being because of my Japanese cultural heritage, right? So, I mean, I think one thing is, in Japan, because there's so many different sects of Buddhism, there's sort of a layer of general Buddhism that is part of the culture. And I think one thing that I started to learn over time was that Jodo Shinshu is such like a kind of a weird sect of Buddhism, right? Like, so much of our practices and how we interpret some of the teachings is very different from the vast majority of sects of Buddhism that most people know about and hear about and understand in both Japan and other parts of the world, right? So that started to get teased out for me by some of the practices in Japan that I just assumed were in line with Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. So, for example, when you go to the temples, right, to the Buddhist temples in Japan, it is very common to, at the little their gift shops or the trolleys or whatever, right, to be able to buy these little charms that you hang from your car, or traffic safety, or like good health or prosperity, right? They call them mamori charms. And so I think my grandfather he'd been sick or something, so I'd gotten him one of the like wellness charms. And the next time I visited him, because he had moved back to Osaka, so I visited him and I gave him this charm, and he was like, this is thank you, but this isn't Jodo Shinshu. Like, we're not superstitious. We don't do this. And I was like, oh, okay. Mental note to this is not Jodo Shinshu. So, it's things like that it was, I appreciated certainly the sense of community, which you can relate to the sense of Sangha, right? The ideas of impermanence and treasuring the moment that you're in. I think those things are a part of Japanese culture. And so I could appreciate those, even if it wasn't in an intentional way every day, right? It's kind of things you recognize in hindsight. But it was also, I distinctly remember that time and that feedback from my grandfather, right? For like learning to then try to distinguish between, well, what is true to the teachings of Jodo Shinshu versus general Buddhism.
I have one of those charms for safe travel on each of my camera bags. I haven't thought about myself as being superstitious, but maybe I am. Brant, in one of those earlier email exchanges that you and I had, you mentioned the importance of constantly cultivating what you referred to as the Buddha eye. What's the Buddha eye? And can you share an example of where this cultivation was particularly significant for you?
Yeah, Buddha eye is a term that Maya always uses in her Dharma school teachings, like, talking to the kids, like, make sure you use your Buddha eye, right? I think the best way to, yeah, she has it right here in her forehead, and she kind of moves around like a cyclops. But I think the easiest way to talk about what Buddha eye is, it's basically Dharma tinted glasses, right? For everything you see, but not just see, but what you hear, what you feel, what you touch, what you experience, what you engage with. It's just sort of a heightened level of awareness that you should be living in the present moment, but kind of just thinking about, Eightfold Path or like how that might, impact it, right? And the thing is, it needs to be a constantly cultivated thing, because in order for it to really be effective, I think it kind of needs to be somewhat second nature in terms of, because you're constantly thinking about it. You can't, stop in the middle of the road and be like, this road rage I'm feeling right now, how does that now link to the teachings, right? That'll be bad. But I think Dharma is everywhere. I think lessons are everywhere. I think one of the most eureka type moments for me about Buddha eye sort of taking effect is around this idea of mindfulness, right, from the Eightfold Path. We had received a photo album from my grandma for when my dad was 1 year old, and it was like a really old book, so the construction pages that the pictures are attached on were crumbling. It was all black and white photos. I never met my grandfather. My dad's dead. He died before I was born. So I never saw like a lot of pictures of him, right? And I constantly wondered, like, what was he like? What was his nature like? What did he look like? And did he hang out with my dad? And like all these questions. And as I was looking through the album, I was like digitizing the photos for my grandma. I was like, man, he's not in any of these pictures, right? So I'm feeling like a sense of loss, because like, where is this guy, right? Like, I want to know more about him. And then the mindfulness part came in, where I was like, where is he? And I was like, oh, he's taking the pictures. So then you go back, and then when you look at it again, right, it's like through a different lens. You're like, oh, wow. He was there for that moment. You see things differently, like the Popular Mechanics magazines on the shelf. Oh, he was a nerd like me, right? So I think that's a good example of Buddha eye kind of acting in very like non-intuitive ways when you least expect it, but when it hits you, you're just like, whoa. That to me is like what constant cultivation means.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So, Maya, I'd like to go back to Japan for one more question. You engaged in various cultural practices like taiko and non-competitive martial art, which emphasizes self-defense as well as mental health and training. How did these experiences influence your connection to Jodo Shinshu and your overall spiritual growth?
Yeah, so I'll probably focus on the martial art for this response, right? So I had never tried martial arts before. I went to Japan, but everyone, when we arrived, right, I was part of the JEP program, which is a pretty well-established program in Japan. So the communities that have those English teachers in their midst are pretty used to reaching out to invite them, the foreign teachers, to partake in their community activities. So I was fortunate enough to be invited to participate in this martial art called Shorinji Kempo, which some of the parents at the schools that I was teaching at were a part of. And so they would pick me up a couple times a week and drive me to the dojo. And I'd never heard of this martial art before we started, but we just thought it would be something interesting to try out. And so the first practice that I went to, I was a little bit baffled because everyone lines up, and then the lead teacher, unrolls the scroll and starts reading this whole reading, and then everyone does gasho, and then they proceed with practice. And the whole reading was in Japanese, so I had no idea what they were saying. But a couple of the other folks who went there spoke really good English, and so they were explaining to us that, Shorinji Kempo is based in the Buddhist tradition. So actually, like, as you move up the ranks, you also need to move up the ranks in becoming a minister for this to be able to achieve the ranks, which I thought was fascinating, right? And because I was Buddhist, but there weren't any Shin Buddhists around me where I was teaching. So, I even though I passed like Buddhist temples when I would bike to the bus station or what have you, I didn't really have a way to practice with other Sangha members while I was living in Japan. So Shorinji Kempo became kind of like one of my applied methods of practicing Buddhism, right? And it's like even how they explain the why behind some of the techniques, right? There's one where if someone's attacking you and you want them to stop attacking you, they teach you to do this hand flick right at their eyes, right? And the why behind that is because it startles them. If you get hit in the eyes, it startles them and it temporarily blinds you, but doesn't cause permanent damage, right? So everything is just meant to stop the conflict and not permanently harm the other person, because it's recognizing the humanity in all of us, right? So I think it was things like that again, in hindsight, right, when you're sort of young and living life and just like having a ball, living abroad and stuff, right, you're not necessarily seeing these things in the moment, but in hindsight, I think that really started to instill in me that these were all practical applications of the Dharma, right? That the Dharma really is not just a thing that's only for temple on Sundays, that there are ways to see it's when you cultivate that Buddhist eye, right? Like Brant was just talking about, there are ways to see and hear the teachings in our daily lives, no matter what you're doing. And whether that's Shorinji Kempo made that clear to me because of the explicit references to Buddhism and to Buddhist teachings. But if you take that approach to like the applied practice of the Dharma, even eating or driving, right? There's any activity that we do really can carry that ability if we have the intention.
Thank you. As the only remaining founding member of Nendaiko, what has being part of this Taiko group meant to you over the years, and how do you see it connecting to your Buddhist practice?
Yeah, so Nendaiko started in 1994, and right, it was originally started as sort of a community activity tied to the temple. So it was Buddhist taiko because it was taiko played by Buddhists. but I feel like the way we talk about Nindaiko as Buddhist Taiko now has changed over the years, right? So in terms of what the group has meant to me, I think the group itself to me has meant family. It is truly a part of my Sangha community, right? And I don't necessarily use those terms when I'm in Nindaiko, but they are truly family. And that is true even though the makeup of the group has changed a lot over the years. To me, it's not just the current group and sort of the gel factor that we have within the current group, but it's we're celebrating our 30th anniversary year. And we just did 30 hours of taiko, which was crazy. But as part of that, we did, one of our members, Carla, did a number of interviews with some of our former members. And some of our former members also dialed in during the 30 hours, right? And even though it had been many years since I'd seen some of those folks, like, again, it was like my tribe growing up. When you see them again, it's still part of your family, right? And I liken it to, we were talking in the group at one point about how we've sort of lost that shiny feature. Like when we look at other taiko groups where either they're new groups or they have a lot of new members, there's so much excitement and like enthusiasm that comes across in their playing. And we were lamenting a little bit about how we've lost some of that shiny edge. But to me, it is the difference between being newly married and being like 15 years into marriage, right? Where it is a level of deep contentment and sort of an understanding of who you are and who you're with, that really creates like a much deeper bond, and that comes out in a different way than like the enthusiasm and shininess, right? Initially, when Nindaiko started, it was very much that, oh, it's something fun to do with the Ekoji Sangha and the Ekoji family, right? And now the way we talk about Nindaiko as Buddhist Taiko it is the practical application of the Dharma. And I think that the function of explicitly stating that, right, and then talking within the group about what that means, what are the teachings that we want all the group members to appreciate, even if they're not Buddhists themselves, because they sort of underpin how we approach the art of taiko. Explaining that over and over, internally and externally, then also helps me on a regular basis be able to really appreciate the applied practice for Nindaiko and for Shin Buddhism. So, the group has, certainly you grow artistically, although I still get offbeat many, many times, right? Or freeze in the moment, and then it's the idea of ego. But how the group has evolved has also helped me grow spiritually because of the explaining and building my own Buddhist eye in that practice.
Thank you very much, Maya. Brant, I've got a nerdy question for you, and it's one of those that we could spend all day talking about. I'm going to ask you to kind of give us the short and sweet answer. You've described the Dharma through the lens of complex adaptive systems. Could you elaborate on how this scientific perspective helps you interpret Buddhist teachings and apply them to your everyday life?
I think if you boil it down, it can be succinctly covered with the idea that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. The canonical sort of like example of what complex adaptive systems are started with this guy named Herbert Simon, who gave this example of a pocket watch, right? And the thing is, like, if you take it apart, you have these assemblies and you have sub-assemblies and you have all these different pieces. But the thing is, like, you can't really predict what the larger thing is going to do just by looking at the individual cog, right? The individual gear or the spring. They are fundamental to making the larger thing work, but you can't predict what the larger thing is going to be just by looking at the parts, right? And from that basic understanding, it spills off into a whole idea of like interdependence on the individual pieces, right? Knowing that how they're going to be used is built upon like how the system is constantly changing. causes and conditions of this thing affecting the larger thing. And so anyway, it happened, my studies around this idea mapped with with my growth in the Dharma also as a Dharma school teacher. So it was like this unique situation, perfect storm, right? Where I like have an idea here and it gets corroborated, except in different terms here, and then I bring that over here, and it just went back and forth. So for me, it was like a really exciting time, mentally, academically in my life during that time. And I think the specific area where I look at is if you think about the pocket watch, it's more to the lines of complexity, but its relationship to social systems. So instead of thinking about springs and gears and those kinds of things, think about individuals or nonprofits or political parties or states or those kinds of things, and how do they interact and what happens. Our behaviors are shaped by our interactions with other people. They're shaped by interactions with other aspects of a larger system in society, right? And vice versa, the feedback from that changes who we are. So things are constantly changing. Our actions, because of that, daisy chain off and domino effect into other people's behaviors, which affects the whole, which affects individuals again. So it's like this gigantic web of interdependencies that basically describe the world we live in now.
Yeah.
So in my mind, I think Buddha was the first complexity scientist. They just used different terms. It was Dharma terms versus like academic terms. So yeah, I think the ties are there, and I think we need stuff like this, different perspectives to couch the Dharma, to explain the Dharma to different people, have it resonate to them, because how we listen to it now is not how we might have listened to it yesterday or how we're going to listen to it tomorrow. So, just like that example of how we're constantly changing, the Dharma needs to adapt too. We need to help other people use the personification of Amida, right, of compassion. We use things like capital A, capital C, and those kinds of things. Jataka tales, sweet tea raining from the heavens, like these help us remember things, but at the same time, we should also have other stories that help other people who want to learn it or remember it in different ways that maybe doesn't stretch, a lot of the logical imagination that we have, because the message is the same. It's just we need different ways of hearing it. So that's why I think trying to cultivate these different perspectives. In my case, like I think scientific perspectives are very interesting, but this is just one of many paths that I think we need to be taking for Buddhism in the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Maya, you and Brant took a thoughtful approach to naming your children Connor and Nami, reflecting both on your ethnic and spiritual traditions. Can you share more about the significance of their names and how they connect to your family's values?
Yeah. So names to me are really interesting things, right? Because they tend to reflect the values and priorities of the parents. And in many cases, sort of the hopes and dreams for the kids' futures as told by their parents, right? So in Japanese American tradition, it's pretty common to have sort of a American first name and then a Japanese middle name and then the family name. So Brant and I wanted to follow that for our kids as well. So we wanted them to each have a Japanese name, but we also wanted them to have Buddhist ties in their names. So for Connor, we chose Connor, which is a non-Japanese name. We sometimes will joke because it's a strong Irish name. So sometimes we'll joke that he should have been Connor Horio, right? But we chose Connor because one of the meanings for it is wisdom, right? Which is a central tenet to Buddhism. And then his middle name, for his Japanese middle name, we chose Masamichi. And Masamichi, the characters that we chose mean true or pure path. And that had the nice connotation for us of sort of also the middle path, right? We wanted whatever path Connor chooses and that his life takes him on to be true to him, to be a pure path in terms of, right, not falling towards drugs or what have you, but really being helping him live a life that is authentic to himself and his values. And it has the ties to the family because we use the same first character from Masa that's from my middle name. So both Brant and I, our middle names also start with Masa. So we wanted to use one of those the characters from our names in Connor's middle name as well. So that's where Connor's name came from. And then for Nami's name we actually chose before Connor's, before we knew the gender of our first child. So Nami is not actually a traditional Western name, right? But we chose Nami because we both love the analogy, the Buddhist analogy of the ocean and the wave, where for those who might not be familiar with it, right, the wave is sort of likened to us as individuals, where you can see our form, it's distinct, right? But when the wave crashes on the seashore and folds back into the ocean, you realize the wave was never separate from that larger ocean. And we love that idea, right? That we are all part of that greater oneness. And so that's why we chose Nami's first name, right? So it translates to wave. And then her middle name, we chose Chiyoko. So we sort of broke from the wanting to have all of our middle names start with the Masa because we loved the name Chiyoko and the meaning so much that we sort of broke from that part of our desired tradition. So Chiyoko translates to child of 1,000 generations. And that for us had two meanings. One was sort of the literal translation, child of 1,000 generations, right? Family is our number one priority. And so we wanted Nami to also feel that tie, right, to her heritage and to the family lines. But child of 1,000 generations can also be interpreted as the millions of causes and conditions that all had to line up perfectly for her to be born to us, right, and for us all to have this opportunity to enjoy her life. And so each of those generations, right, are the causes and conditions that had to happen for her to be born as she is. So that's Nami Chiyoko.
Excellent. Thank you. So word on the street has it that you desire to write a book on Buddhism, and maybe through the lens of complexity science. If you were to do that, what would be your major goal, your major message that you'd like to get across to people?
Yeah, this is sort of like just an initial thought, right? So I don't know how much I have to say on the topic, but this goes back to my previous comments that we need more tools in the shed to be the right message for the right person at the right time. What I love about the examples that I talked about earlier about how this particular scientific field has a lot of parallels to the teachings of the Dharma is that it also provides a lot of real world examples for the life we live now and the society we live now that help provide practical context for what the Dharma is about. But not only that, but it comes with the scientific sort of like attachments that come with it, right? So it's evidence, testing, models, the ability to explore and to interrogate a concept or an idea, to be able to say, is that really interdependent? What happens if I change these levers? And so there's a lot of examples from the research side of it that I think will provide new ways of exploring the Dharma hands-on, to be able to test effects, to be able to kind of see what the impact is going to be. And maybe in that way, get you some observational evidence, right, that these teachings can mean something, and to continue to cultivate that Buddha eye, that introspection can now, be maybe handled differently, right? So I think it's just about these different perspectives, more tools in the shed.
Thank you.
Maya, the three treasures are the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. How has your understanding of Sangha changed over time, and why is Sangha important to you, and who is your Sangha?
So I think my appreciation of Sangha has really changed over time, right? I think I used to take the Sangha piece for granted, that they're just the people who learn alongside you, and they're their other temple members is kind of how I feel like I grew up thinking about Sangha, right? They're the people chanting next to me. But especially, I will say, especially because of the Dharma discussion group that we have after service now at Ekoji, I think that group has really grown my appreciation for what the Sangha really is. And now I think the way I would define the value of the Sangha is you can't, I feel like you can't truly broaden your understanding of the teachings and your appreciation of what the Buddha understood and taught to others unless you are also engaging with your fellow Sangha members. And by engaging, I don't just mean sitting beside them and chanting, right? I mean actually hearing how they are hearing the Dharma and how their own experiences have built the frame through which they understand and hear the Dharma, whether this is their first time they're encountering the Dharma, right? And sort of offering thoughts on what that initial reflection is, or whether it's someone who has grown up in and steeped in the Dharma, but hearing it in new ways, right? I don't think I really fully appreciated that until the Dharma discussion groups, where you not only get the chance to reflect for yourself on what you heard in the message, but then to hear what everyone else heard and how it could be different, or how it could spur an even deeper appreciation of the message or a different interpretation of the message, right? And then also then being given the opportunity to explicitly reflect, right? Because when you have to state the things, and even if it comes out as sort of verbal vomit, right? It's the trying to make more concrete what you're taking away, right? That I had not really experienced that before the Dharma discussion opportunities, and has just given me such a different appreciation for why the Sangha is part of the three treasures, right? So in terms of who is in my Sangha, I don't know, my definition of Sangha today is both broader in some ways, but narrower in some ways, right? Because there's those who I get to engage with in the Dharma, mostly through the Dharma discussion venue, right? Who I am actively learning from and learning with, and certainly those who are providing the messages. But I feel like those who don't attend the discussions or who I don't otherwise get to engage with, they're like untapped potential in my Sangha, right?
I love that. And I also really look forward to our discussion groups after service. So, Brant, it's been almost 40 years since your family moved from Hawaii to the East Coast, and more than 20 years since you founded Ekoji Buddhist Temple. As a fourth-generation Japanese American, what advice would you give a person who's new to Ekoji and Jodo Shinshu Buddhism?
You might have left out the 40 years piece. That would have been okay too. But in terms of advice to provide, I don't know what would be. I think the main thing that I would say, other than this is a process, I would say that this is a process. It's not an immediate thing of salvation or enlightenment, but it's a process that you don't want to scare them off by saying it will be a process for the rest of your life. But you could probably say that it's a process, right? It's a process that's really driven by introspection. And that's, I think, the only way that you will be able to really make, significant advancements in terms of what your understanding is. And, I think that the more questions you ask, the more you're able to try to link it to practical examples, I think is probably one of the ways to really, usher that process along. I think it comes down to Buddha Eye again, because I think everywhere you look, that message will be there. but how you find it and what you are training yourself to be aware of comes from that Buddha eye experience, right? You may see this thing every now and then, and you may have one understanding of it that does contribute to your process. But as you learn more about the Dharma, like don't be afraid to revisit those kinds of experiences or those situations and think about them again, because you never know what new levels of understanding might sort of come from it. So I think that's my biggest thing, that it's just a process.
Thanks, Brant. And if we hear something today that we heard a year ago, we're a different person today. We'll
That's
hear
right.
it differently.
Yeah.
It may apply to our lives differently. Before I ask the last question, I want to congratulate the two of you for co-chairing this year's Bonadori Festival at Ekoji. By all accounts, all the people I've talked to, it was a huge success. And having been involved in Seattle's and White Rivers this year, I know how much work goes into that. So thank you very much. We always end our interviews with the same question, and I'll let you decide who's going to answer first and second. But what does Ekoji mean to the two of you?
Go ahead, Maya.
I was going to sit in silence until you answered. Yeah, I mean, I think Ekoji, to me, it truly is the gift of light, right? In so many different ways. It is, I think has probably come out through some of the other responses in this time together. Ekoji is my second home, right? It is my extended and chosen family. It is a safe space for me to learn and grow and give back to the community. It is a source of both joy and burden. But right, you take those, I mean, that is, it's joy because Ekoji and I mean the teachings writ large, but really it's how Ekoji makes a space to hear the teachings and who is in that space to learn those teachings alongside of me, right? That's what makes it sort of my second home. So all the things that we do to give back to Ekoji, there is truly joy in each of those things because it's just continuing to create that space that has benefited me so much personally.
I think I'll close by saying that I think to me, Ekoji is going back to Maya's first comments at the beginning of this, is a place of self-discovery, right? I think the thing that I appreciate most about Buddhism is that I think the core of the teachings is about outlining truths, awareness, generalities, but it doesn't specify like a specific thing that you need to be doing. I think it recognizes our individual situations, our individual states are all different. So how we get to the end goal or what we do with that is going to be unique to us. So to me, Ekoji is a place to safely test that, to find out what that means to us, and then use those insights to sort of help us navigate what we think it means for us in terms of the Buddhist path.
Thank you. So thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Stay connected with us on Facebook and Instagram for updates on our services and programs. For more resources, check out our show notes below. Ekoji's mission is to unite the Sangha globally through our gatherings and streaming services. A big thank you to Maya and Brant for joining us today. I'm Andrea Chapman with Joe Gochi. On behalf of Ekoji Buddhist Temple, we appreciate your support. Namo Amida Butsu.
Namo Amida Butsu.